The hammer sat on the oil-stained workbench, its handle worn smooth by 4 decades of grip, the steel head marked with 2 small stamped letters, CM, and had not been lifted in 3 days. That was the first wrong thing. Carl Mathers never let a tool sit idle for 3 days. He had hung that hammer on its peg the night before the Tuesday in October, and he had not touched it since, because a man who has spent 77 years moving through the world with his hands knows when the world has stopped moving with him. The boxcar they found him in was number 171489, Northern Pacific, built in 1952, decommissioned in 1998, and sitting on a dead spur outside Millersburg, Montana, for 23 years before Carl crawled through its broken door with a rusted hand grinder and 3 gallons of diesel fuel and the kind of desperate hope that only comes when every other door has been locked. The railroad had forgotten this car. The county had forgotten this spur. The children had forgotten their parents. But the hammer remembered everything. It was a number 3 machinist's hammer, 12 ounces, forged in 1969 at the Stanley Tool Plant in New Britain, Connecticut, and it had traveled west in a canvas tool roll with a 27-year-old mechanic named Carl Mathers, who had just married a school secretary named Edna Pierce, and who believed that if you worked hard enough and loved well enough and kept your head down long enough, the world would treat you fairly. The hammer had been with him when he climbed his first locomotive in the Great Northern Yard in Spokane. It had been with him when he held Edna's hand through 2 miscarriages and 1 live birth. It had been with him when the railroad was bought and sold and split and merged and renamed until the men who signed the paychecks didn't know what a journal box was or why you needed a 12-ounce hammer to set a bearing race true. The hammer had outlasted 3 presidents, 5 recessions, and the entire American passenger rail industry. It had not outlasted the Tuesday in October. The door to the boxcar opened at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, the 15th of October, and the man who stepped through was not a railroad man. He wore a Patagonia vest over a pressed Oxford shirt and carried a flashlight that cost more than Carl's first car. Behind him, in the gravel lot where the old grain elevator used to stand, idled a black GMC Yukon with dealer plates and a cracked windshield that hadn't been fixed because the leasing company was supposed to handle it. Dad. The word hung in the cold air like a foreign language. Carl was sitting on an overturned 5-gallon bucket, his bad knee extended, his good knee bent, a cup of instant coffee growing cold in his hands. He had been listening to the wind move through the broken window at the far end of the car, the same wind that had moved through this valley for 10,000 years, and he had been thinking about the difference between being alone and being abandoned. Dad, we need to talk. Mark Mathers was 46 years old. He owned a home in Billings with a 3-car garage and a mortgage that his father had co-signed. He drove a 2023 Ford F-250 King Ranch with leather seats and a monthly payment that his mother had helped cover for 6 months when Mark's construction business hit a slow season. He had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes and a way of standing with his weight on his back foot that suggested he was already leaving the room before he had finished entering it. Carl did not stand. He did not speak. He lifted the coffee cup and took a sip. The coffee was cold, and he drank it anyway, because he had learned in 40 years on the railroad that you take what you have, and you do not complain about what you do not have, because complaining changes nothing and the train does not wait. We've been trying to reach you for a week, Mark said. The flashlight beam swept across the boxcar, catching the wood stove that Carl had pulled from a demolished farmhouse outside of Circle, the 12-pane window he had cut into the steel wall with the hand grinder he'd found in the rail yard scrap bin, the mattress he had dragged from a dumpster behind the Super 8 motel and cleaned with bleach and baking soda until it smelled more like chemicals than rot. We've been calling. You didn't answer. The phone was in Carl's coat pocket. It was a prepaid flip phone that Edna had bought at Walmart 3 years ago because the landline had been disconnected. It had a cracked screen and a battery that lasted 2 days if you didn't use it, and Carl had not looked at it in a week because the only person who called was his daughter, and the last time his daughter called, she had asked him to sign papers he did not understand. You need to come back to the house, Mark said. We need to talk about Mom. Carl set the coffee cup down on the dirt floor. He placed it exactly in the center of a flat stone he had wedged into the ground, because a man who works on trains learns to put things where they will not fall. The cup did not wobble. His hands did not shake. Is she dead? Carl asked. No, Dad, she's fine, but we need to. Then she's here. Mark's flashlight went still. The beam had found the far corner of the boxcar, where a second mattress lay, this one covered in a quilt that Edna's mother had made in 1962, the year before Carl and Edna were married. The quilt was frayed and stained and smelled of wood smoke and candle wax and the particular mustiness of a life compressed into spaces too small to hold it. "She can't stay here, Dad. Neither of you can. This isn't a home. It has a roof," Carl said. "It has heat. It has a door that locks." "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" Mark did not answer. He had always been a boy who stopped speaking when he ran out of prepared words, and he had come here with a script that did not include his father asking questions. The Boxcar was 39 feet long and 8 feet wide. Carl had measured it the first night, pacing it out in his broken work boots, counting the steps, because a man needs to know the exact dimensions of the space he will die in. The wood stove occupied the center of the car, its chimney pipe running through a hole Carl had cut in the roof with a reciprocating saw he'd traded a case of motor oil. The stove was a 1949 Monarch, cast iron, salvaged from a farmhouse that had been condemned when the family who owned it could no longer afford the taxes. Carl had carried it piece by piece across 2 miles of scrubland, loading the sections onto a hand truck he'd found in a ditch, pulling it behind him like a mule pulling a plow. The stove was heavy. The stove was solid. The stove would outlast every Patagonia vest in the state of Montana. A sound came from the corner, a rustling of quilt and canvas and old bones. Edna Mathers sat up slowly, her white hair pressed flat on one side, her glasses askew, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that had been a gift from a second-grade student in 1989, the year the student had drawn a rainbow on it with markers that were not food-safe, and the school had thrown it away and Edna had fished it out of the trash, because it was the best thing anyone had ever given her. "Mark?" Her voice was thin, the voice of a woman who had not spoken aloud in 2 days. "Is that you?" "It's me, Mom." "Did you bring the children?" "The kids are with Sarah. They're fine." "Did you bring food?" Mark shifted his weight. The flashlight beam wavered. "We need to talk about the house, Mom. The house in Billings. We need to talk about what's going to happen." Carl stood up. His knees cracked, his back complained, his hands found the hammer on the workbench before his mind had fully decided to reach for it. The hammer fit his grip the way a key fits a lock, the way a rail fits a tie plate, the way 40 years of honest labor fits the memory of a man who has done nothing wrong and lost everything anyway. "The house is gone," Carl said. It was not a question. Mark's silence was an answer. "Your mother's house. The house we bought in 1973. The house we paid off in 1998. The house your mother planted the maple tree in front of. The one she watered by hand every summer for 30 years. That house. We had to Dad. The business, I explained this. I sent you the papers. We had to liquidate some assets. You sent me papers I couldn't read. You signed them. I signed what you put in front of me. You always told me to trust you." The hammer was in Carl's hand. He could feel the cold of the steel head, the warmth of the worn hickory handle, the weight of a tool that had never asked a question it could not answer. He set it down on the workbench, exactly where it had been, and he looked at his son's face in the dim light of the boxcar, and he saw nothing there that he recognized. "Your mother sleeps on a mattress on the floor of a boxcar," Carl said. "She eats crackers and canned soup. She washes her hands in a bucket. She is 74 years old and she worked for 32 years as a school secretary, and she never asked anyone for anything in her life, and you have put her in a boxcar. The bank accounts. I don't care about the bank accounts. The house was going into foreclosure. I don't care about the house. Then what do you want me to say, Dad?" "What do you want me to do?" Carl picked up the coffee cup. He poured the cold coffee onto the dirt floor, watching the liquid darken the packed earth, and he set the cup down again empty. "I want you to leave." Mark left. The Yukon's engine started, the headlights swept across the boxcar's rusted walls, and the sound of tires on gravel faded into the October wind. Carl stood at the door and watched the taillights disappear into the dark, and he did not move until the last trace of red had vanished, and then he stayed a little longer, because the only thing worse than being alone was having to watch the person who made you alone drive away in a truck you had helped him buy. Edna Mathers had been a school secretary for 32 years. She started in 1974 at Millersburg Elementary, a 2-story brick building with a bell tower that rang at 8:30 and 3:15, and a boiler that groaned like a dying animal all winter long. Her desk was in the front office, behind a counter that had been worn smooth by the elbows of 1,000 waiting children, and she kept an attendance book in the bottom drawer, a blue cloth-bound ledger with the words Millersburg School District, Daily Attendance Register, 1974-1975, stamped in gold leaf on the cover. She had filled that book every day for her first year, Every student, every teacher, every absence, every tardy, every note from home excusing a child for sickness or a funeral or a day on the farm when the harvest couldn't wait. She had written their names in her careful cursive, Sarah Jenkins, Tommy Ortega, William Cross, Maria Hernandez, and she had learned each face, each voice, each way of walking through the door in the morning. She had been 29 years old that year, newly married to a railroad mechanic who worked 12-hour shifts and came home with grease under his fingernails and a smile that made her forget she had spent all day wiping the noses of children who were not hers. The attendance book was in the boxcar now. It sat on a shelf Carl had built from pallet wood, next to a kerosene lamp and a stack of newspapers from 1985 that had been used for insulation and a photograph of Carl and Edna on their wedding day, June 17, 1973, standing in front of the Methodist Church in Millersburg with rice in their hair and a whole life ahead of them. Edna had not looked at the book in 43 years. She had not needed to. She knew every name by heart, every child who had come through her office with a scraped knee or a lost tooth or a note from a parent who was working 2 jobs and couldn't make it to the parent-teacher conference. She had been the first face those children saw in the morning and the last face they saw in the afternoon, and she had loved them the way a school secretary loves, quietly, consistently, without expectation of return. But in the 3rd week of October, when the cold came down from Canada and the wood stove burned through the last of the scrap lumber Carl had scavenged, Edna took the attendance book down from the shelf and opened it for the first time in 43 years. The pages were yellowed. The ink was faded. The names were written in a hand she barely recognized as her own, younger, more careful, full of the optimism of a woman who believed that the children she wrote down would grow up to be something, and that the world they grew up into would be better than the one she had inherited. She traced her finger down the column of names for October 15, 1974. 28 students present. 2 absent, Maria Hernandez, who had the chickenpox, and Tommy Ortega, whose father had died the week before and who had not come back to school yet. She remembered Tommy. She remembered the way he had sat in her office the day after the funeral, not crying, just sitting, staring at the floor, his hands folded in his lap, waiting for someone to tell him what to do next. She had sat with him for an hour, not speaking, just being present, because she was 29 years old, and she did not know what to say to a boy who had lost his father, and she had learned that sometimes the only thing you can give is your presence. She closed the book. She set it back on the shelf. She looked at her husband, who was feeding scraps of 2x4 into the wood stove, his face illuminated by the orange glow, his hands black with soot and age, a man who had built a home from the wreckage of his life. She said. He turned. "I want to see the hammer." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked to the workbench and picked up the machinist's hammer and brought it to her, holding it the way you hold something sacred, something that has been with you longer than any person you have ever known. She took it in her hands. The handle was worn smooth in the center, rough at the ends, shaped by 40 years of grip. The steel head was pitted and scarred, the face mushroomed from 1,000 strikes, the claw bent from 1,000 pulls. The initials CM were still visible, stamped into the side with a letter punch Carl had bought at a hardware store in 1969 for $3.75. "You never told me why you chose this hammer," she said. Carl sat down on the bucket. The stove popped. The wind pushed against the steel walls of the boxcar, and the whole structure creaked like a ship at sea, and Carl Mathers looked at the hammer in his wife's hands and remembered a moment he had never described to anyone. He was 23 years old. It was 1969, and he was standing in the tool aisle of a hardware store in Spokane, Washington, with $30 in his pocket and a job offer from the Great Northern Railway that would start in 3 days. He had never been on a train. He had never been east of the Cascade Mountains. He had never been in love with a woman who would wait for him while he learned how to keep locomotives running on a continent that was slowly forgetting how to need them. The hardware store smelled of oil and lumber and the particular dust of a building that had stood for 60 years. The tools hung on pegboard walls, arranged by size and function, and Carl had walked the aisles for an hour, picking up wrenches and socket sets and screwdrivers, setting them down, picking them up again. He did not know what he would need. He did not know if he would be any good at the job. He did not know if he would last a week. The hammer was on a middle shelf, between a ball peen and a cross peen, and he picked it up because it was the right weight, because the handle was the right length, because it fit his hand the way nothing had ever fit his hand before. The steel head was unmarked, unmarred, perfect. He had taken it to the counter and paid $18.50 and walked out into the October sun of Spokane with a hammer in his hand and a future he could not see. He had stamped his initials into the side that night, using a letter punch he'd borrowed from a man at the boarding house who said he was a machinist, but who Carl later learned was a thief and a drunk and a liar. The punch had been the only honest thing about him. The letters CM had gone into the steel clean and deep, and Carl had held the hammer up to the light and seen his name in the metal and thought, I am a railroad mechanic now. I chose it because it fit, Carl said. That's all, it fit. Edna ran her thumb across the initials. It still fits. They sat together in the light of the wood stove, two old people in a boxcar on a dead spur in a valley that had been forgotten by everyone except the wind, and they did not speak, because there are some things that cannot be improved by words. The Tuesday in October had started like any other Tuesday. Carl had woken at 5:30 a.m., as he had woken every morning for 54 years, because the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. He had made coffee on the stove, the same instant coffee he had been drinking since the 1970s, when Edna had bought a jar of Folgers and told him it was the same as brewed, and he had never had the heart to tell her it wasn't. He had sat at the kitchen table of the house on Maple Street, the house they had bought in 1973 for $18,500, the house where they had raised their children, the house where Edna had planted the maple tree that had grown tall enough to shade the entire front yard. The kitchen was warm. The sun was coming through the window over the sink, the same window where Edna had stood washing dishes for 40 years, looking out at the maple tree she had planted, the tree that had been a sapling when she put it in the ground and was now tall enough to hold a swing. Edna was still in bed. She had been sleeping later lately, staying under the covers until 7 or 8, her body refusing to cooperate with the schedule it had kept for 7 decades. Carl did not mind. He liked the quiet of the morning, the hour when the house belonged only to him, and the coffee and the memory of all the mornings that had come before. At 8:15, he heard a car in the driveway. At 8:17, the front door opened. At 8:19, Mark walked into the kitchen with a folder full of papers, followed by Carl's daughter, Sarah, who was carrying a canvas tote bag that said "World's Best Teacher" on the side, which was ironic because Sarah was not a teacher. Sarah was a real estate agent. "Dad," Sarah said. "We need to talk about the house." Carl set down his coffee cup. "What about it?" "The payments." "You're behind." "I'm not behind. I paid the mortgage. I've always paid the mortgage." "Dad," Mark said, opening the folder, "the mortgage was refinanced 3 years ago. You signed the papers." "The payments went up." "I never refinanced." "You did. I helped you, remember? You came to my office and I had the papers ready, and you signed them." Carl remembered sitting in a chair in a room that smelled of new carpet and printer ink. He remembered Mark placing papers in front of him, pages and pages of fine print, and Mark pointing to the lines where he needed to sign. He remembered asking what the papers were for, and Mark saying it was just some paperwork for the house, just a formality, just something to make sure everything was in order. "I told you it was a refinance," Mark said. "Lower interest rate, better terms." "You agreed. You said it was paperwork." "It was paperwork. For the refinance. I don't remember refinancing." "Dad, you signed it. It's right here." Carl looked at the papers. His signature was on every page, shaky and uncertain, the signature of a man who had spent his life working with his hands and had never been comfortable with a pen. It was his signature. There was no question about that. Where did the money go? Mark closed the folder. "What money?" "The money from the refinance. If you refinanced the house, there was money, cash. What happened to it?" "Dad, the refinance paid off some debts. Credit cards, medical bills. The roof repair. I didn't have any debts. Mom did. Your mother doesn't have credit cards." Mark was silent. Sarah was looking at the floor. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked, the same clock that had been ticking since 1973. A white General Electric clock with a sweep second hand that Carl had bought at a hardware store for $4 and hung above the refrigerator because Edna had said she needed to see the time from the stove. "Where is your mother's money?" Mark opened the folder again. He pulled out a second set of papers, these ones from a bank in Billings, and he laid them on the kitchen table the way you lay out evidence at a trial. Mom's accounts were transferred to a joint account with Sarah. For management purposes, when you two started having trouble with the bills, we thought it would be easier to consolidate. I didn't have trouble with the bills. The power was shut off twice last winter, Dad, because the checks got lost in the mail. The checks didn't get lost in the mail. You forgot to send them. I never forgot. You did. Twice. The power company called me. Carl looked at the papers. He looked at the numbers, the dates, the signatures. He saw his name. He saw Edna's name. He saw the names of his children listed as joint holders, authorized signatories, trustees. How much? Dad, How much did you take? Mark closed the folder. He looked at his father, and there was something in his eyes that might have been shame or might have been calculation, and Carl realized that he did not know his son well enough to tell the difference. We didn't take anything. We moved the money. To protect it. Protect it from who? From you. The room went quiet. The clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. The maple tree outside the window rustled in the October wind, and Carl Mathers looked at his son and his daughter and understood, for the first time in his life, what it meant to be betrayed by someone you had taught to tie his shoes. You took your mother's money. We moved it. Where is it now? It's safe. Where is it? In an account with my name on it. And Sarah's. Give it back. Dad, we can't. Give it back. We can't. We can't. It's already been used. For what? For the business. For Mark's business, Sarah said. Her voice was quiet, careful, the voice of someone who knows they have done something wrong and is trying to make it sound right. The construction company was in trouble. He was going to lose everything. The house. The trucks. Everything. So you took your mother's savings. We didn't take it. We borrowed it. Did you ask? We didn't think we had to. It's family money. It was your mother's money. It's all the same, Dad. It's family. We're all in this together. Carl stood up. His knees ached. His back ached. His hands found the edge of the kitchen table, the same table where they had eaten Thanksgiving dinner for 40 years, where the children had done their homework, where Edna had paid the bills every month with a checkbook and a calculator and a mug of tea that always went cold before she finished it. You need to leave. Dad, leave. We're trying to help you. Help me. You took my wife's money. You took her house. You cleaned out her accounts, and you came here to tell me about in my own kitchen, and you think you're helping me? We're trying to protect you. Protect me from what? From yourself. From the mistakes you're making. From the situation you've gotten yourself into. What situation? This. Mark gestured at the kitchen, the house, the life. You can't manage this anymore, Dad. You're 77 years old. Mom is 74. You're forgetting things. You're losing things. You're not capable of handling your own affairs. I've been handling my own affairs since before you were born, and now you can't. The words hung in the air. The clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. The maple tree rustled, and Carl Mathers stood in his own kitchen and realized that his son believed what he was saying. How much is left? Mark hesitated. About $1,100. In the account? In the account. And the house? The house is going into foreclosure. The payments were too high, we couldn't keep up. You refinanced it, you took the equity, and then you let it go into foreclosure. We didn't have a choice. There is always a choice. Not for us. Not for the business. Not for... Get out. Dad, get out of my house. Mark closed the folder. Sarah picked up her canvas tote. They walked to the front door, and Carl followed them, and when they were standing on the porch, he looked at his son one last time. Your mother raised you, Carl said. She stayed home when you were sick. She made your lunches. She went to your games. She sat with you when you had nightmares. She loved you, and you took everything she had. We didn't. You took everything. And you left her with nothing. Mark opened his mouth to speak, and then he closed it, and he turned and walked to his truck, and Sarah followed, and Carl watched them drive away, and then he went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the clock and the refrigerator and the window over the sink, and he did not cry, because a man who has spent his life fixing things knows that some things cannot be fixed. He waited until Edna woke up, and then he made her breakfast, and he told her that the children had come to visit, and that they were fine, and that everything was fine, and he did not tell her about the house or the money or the foreclosure, because he did not know how to tell the woman he had loved for 54 years that their children had taken everything and left them with nothing. The eviction notice came 6 days later. The sheriff arrived on a Thursday, a young man with a shaved head and kind eyes who handed Carl a piece of paper and said he was sorry. The bank had already changed the locks. The moving truck came on Friday, and the men in the truck took everything: the furniture, the dishes, the clothes, the photographs, the clock from the kitchen wall, the table where they had eaten Thanksgiving dinner for 40 years. They took the maple tree too, or at least they took the yard it grew in. Carl had packed one bag. Edna had packed two. They had $180 in cash, a bag of crackers, and a box of instant coffee. The boxcar had been sitting on the dead spur for 23 years. Carl had noticed it on his way to the grocery store, walking along the abandoned right-of-way because it was shorter than the road, and he had stopped and looked at the rusted steel door and the broken windows and the graffiti that had faded to ghostly shapes under the Montana sun. He had stood there for a long time, a retired railroad mechanic looking at the carcass of a railroad car, and he had felt something he had not felt in weeks. The door was locked. but the lock was rusted, and Carl's hands still knew how to open a rusted lock. He had forced the door open and stepped inside, and the smell of old steel and dry rot and pigeon droppings had filled his nose, and he had stood in the empty shell of the boxcar and seen a home. It took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of walking 12 miles a day, scavenging, trading, carrying. 6 weeks of sleeping in a shelter and eating at the mission and working from dawn until dark on a steel box that the railroad had forgotten. 6 weeks of Edna sitting on a bench in the town park, wrapped in her coat, reading library books and pretending she was not living in a boxcar. The wood stove came first. Carl had found it in the demolished farmhouse outside of Circle, the chimney pipe still attached, the firebox full of ash and mouse droppings. He had dismantled it piece by piece, carrying the sections across 2 miles of frozen ground, loading them onto the hand truck he had found in a ditch. The stove was heavy. The stove was solid. The stove was a 1949 Monarch, cast iron, made in the same year that Carl Mathers had been born, and he had carried it home like a man carrying a promise. The window came second. Carl had found the grinder in the rail yard's scrap bin, a Milwaukee 4.5-inch angle grinder with a frayed cord and a cracked guard. He had taken it to the shelter and spent an hour cleaning the commutator with a piece of sandpaper he'd found in the trash. The grinder worked. The cutting wheel was worn to almost nothing, but it was enough. He had measured the window opening carefully, marking the steel with a piece of chalk, and he had cut through the boxcar wall with the patience of a man who had spent 40 years cutting through steel. The window itself came from a salvage yard in Billings, a 12-pane double-hung window, white paint peeling, one pane cracked but otherwise intact. The man at the salvage yard had wanted $20. Carl had offered $10. They settled on $15, and Carl had carried the window 12 miles back to the boxcar, stopping every half mile to rest, his arms shaking, his back screaming, his mind fixed on the image of Edna looking out a window at the Montana sky. The insulation came from old feed sacks. Carl had found them behind a barn outside of Millersburg, 50 or 60 burlap sacks that had once held oats and barley and had been left to rot in the weather. He had washed them in the creek, dried them in the sun, and stuffed them between the steel ribs of the boxcar, creating a barrier against the cold that was not perfect but was better than nothing. The bed frames came from a dumpster behind the Super 8 motel. 2 metal frames, bent but usable, with mattresses that smelled of strangers and cigarettes. Carl had cleaned the mattresses with bleach and baking soda and left them in the sun for 3 days until the smell was mostly gone. The workbench came from a shipping pallet. The shelves came from scrap lumber. The door lock came from a hardware store in Millersburg, purchased with the last $20 of the $180 because a home without a lock is not a home. They had been in the boxcar for 32 days when the railroad discovered them. The man who found them was named Roy Barnes, and he was 63 years old, and he had worked for the railroad for 41 years, and he had been sent to inspect the dead spur because someone in the corporate office had noticed that the spur was still on the books and had asked why the company was paying property tax on a spur that had not been used in 23 years. Roy drove an F-150 with 240,000 miles on the odometer and a coffee stain on the dashboard that had been there since 2012. He wore a yellow hard hat and a high-visibility vest and steel-toed boots that had been resoled 3 times. He had a wife named Diane and a daughter who lived in Seattle and a grandson he had seen twice in the 4 years since the boy was born. He had parked at the end of the gravel road and walked the remaining quarter mile to the spur, and he had stopped when he saw the boxcar, because the boxcar had a window where no window had been before, and a stovepipe sticking out of the roof and smoke rising from the stovepipe into the cold October sky. Roy had walked up to the door and knocked. He had knocked like you knock on a door you expect to be answered, not like you knock on a boxcar that has been abandoned for 23 years. The door opened. A man stood in the doorway, a man with white hair and a lined face and hands that looked like they had spent a lifetime holding tools. The man was wearing a railroad mechanic's jacket, blue cotton, worn at the elbows, with the name Carl embroidered over the left breast pocket. "Can I help you?" Carl asked. "I'm Roy Barnes. I work for the railroad. This is railroad property." "I know. You can't live here." "I know. You're going to have to leave." "I know." Roy looked past Carl into the boxcar. He saw the wood stove, the window, the mattress in the corner, the shelf with the kerosene lamp and the blue attendance book, and the photograph of a man and a woman on their wedding day. He saw a woman sitting on the edge of the mattress, wrapped in a quilt, watching him with the steady gaze of someone who has nothing left to lose. "How long have you been here?" 32 days. "Where were you before?" "The shelter." Roy took off his hard hat. He ran his hand over his bald head, a habit he had picked up in the years since his hair had left him, a gesture that meant he was thinking about something he did not want to think about. I'm going to have to report this. I figured. I don't have a choice. I figured that too. Roy looked at the boxcar again. He looked at the wood stove, the Monarch's 1949 cast iron salvaged from a farmhouse that no longer existed. He looked at the window, cut into the steel with a hand grinder, the window that let in the light. He looked at the woman in the quilt, and he looked at the man in the doorway, and he thought about the difference between a job and a life. I'll give you a week, Roy said. A week? A week? To find somewhere else to go. I'll come back in 7 days, and if you're still here, I'll have to call the sheriff. Carl nodded. Thank you. Thank you. Thank me. I'm not doing you any favors. You're giving me a week. A week is not a favor. A week is a week. Roy walked back to his truck. He drove away, and the dust from the gravel road rose behind him, and Carl stood in the doorway of the boxcar and watched the dust settle and the road empty and the sky turn gray with clouds coming down from Canada. The week passed. Carl did not find anywhere else to go. On the 6th day, Roy Barnes returned. He came in the evening after his shift, driving his personal truck instead of the company truck. He parked at the end of the gravel road and walked to the boxcar, and this time he was carrying something in his hand, a cardboard box, held together with duct tape, with holes punched in the sides. What's that? Carl asked. Roy set the box on the ground. Lights? Lights? The sun sets early this time of year. You need light. There's a lamp in there, battery-powered. Some candles, a box of matches, some canned goods my wife insisted on sending. I can't take, you can take it, or you can leave it. I don't care. But I told my wife about you, and she said if I didn't bring you something, she'd divorce me, and I've been married 38 years, and I'm not about to let a boxcar tramp ruin it. Carl looked at the box. He looked at Roy. He looked at the sky, the clouds, the fading light of October. You didn't report me. I didn't say that. You didn't report me. If you had reported me, the sheriff would have come, not you. Roy was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his boots, the steel-toed boots that had been resoled 3 times, the boots of a man who had spent 41 years walking on railroad ties and ballast and gravel and concrete. I checked your file, Roy said. Carl Mathers, 69, retired 2009, 40 years, master mechanic. Best bearing fitter in the Northern Division, never missed a shift, never filed a complaint, never took a sick day that wasn't earned. That was a long time ago. 40 years is not a long time. 40 years is everything. Roy reached into his jacket and pulled out a piece of paper. It was folded, creased, worn at the edges. He handed it to Carl. What's this? Your pension agreement. The original. From 1969. Carl unfolded the paper. The ink was faded. The type was old, the letters uneven, the kind of type you got from a manual typewriter in an office that smelled of cigarette smoke and coffee grounds. He read the first line. This agreement is entered into between the Northern Pacific Railroad and Carl Mathers, hereinafter referred to as the employee. I kept it, Roy said. I keep all of them. Every man who retired from my crew, I kept their papers. Figured someone ought to remember. Carl's hands trembled. The paper rustled in the wind. Why are you showing me this? Because I called the pension office, Roy said, yesterday, after I brought the box. I told them I had a retiree living in a boxcar on my section, and I wanted to know how that was possible. They told me your pension was suspended in 2012. Administrative error. A computer glitch. They said they sent you letters, but you'd moved. I moved. Where'd you move to? Carl didn't answer. He folded the paper carefully along the old creases and handed it back. Keep it, Roy said. I made a copy. Act 6, the call came on a Tuesday. Carl had no phone, so Roy brought the message. He drove out in his truck, the same gravel road, the same October sky, only now there was frost on the ground in the mornings, and the leaves were gone from the cottonwoods, and the boxcar was cold. They want to talk to you, Roy said. The pension office. They said they can reinstate it. Back all of it. 8 years. Carl was sitting on the milk crate by the wood stove. The stove was burning, but barely. He had been rationing wood, not knowing how long he would need to make it last. Why now? Because I made a stink, Roy said. I called the union. I called the regional manager. I called a reporter from the Minot Daily News. I told them I had a 40-year man living in a boxcar with no heat and no running water, and if they didn't fix it, I'd make sure every paper in the state ran the story. You did that. I did that. Carl looked at the stove. The fire crackled. The light flickered across the corrugated walls. I don't have a phone. Use mine. They'll want to talk to me. In person. They'll want me to sign things. Then I'll drive you. You've done enough. I haven't done anything, Roy said. I'm still going to make you leave. You understand that. The company says the boxcar has to be removed. It's a liability. They're going to haul it away and scrap it. You can't stay here. I know. So you need somewhere to go, and you need money to get there. And the only way you're getting money is if you go to Bismarck and sign those papers. Carl stood up. He was stiff from the cold, from sleeping on the plywood, from living on canned beans and bread that Roy's wife had sent. He picked up his jacket, the same jacket he had worn for 15 years, the elbows patched with duct tape. Let's go. The pension office was in a state building on the edge of Bismarck, a low concrete structure with fluorescent lights and carpet that smelled of dust and cleaning fluid. Carl sat in a plastic chair while a young woman in a blazer explained the paperwork. She had kind eyes and a voice that was careful, as if she was afraid of breaking something. Mr. Mathers, I want to apologize. This should never have happened. The error was in our system, and it wasn't caught because your file was misfiled after the merger. Northern Pacific merged with Burlington in 1970, then with Santa Fe in 1996, then with BNSF in 2005. Your paperwork got lost somewhere in the transition. I was still getting my pension. Until the system update in 2012, when we converted to a new database, your record was flagged as inactive, and the payments stopped. The system automatically generated a notice, but the address we had on file was your old one. I moved. You moved. And we didn't have a forwarding address. Carl nodded. He looked at the papers. The numbers on them were larger than he had expected. Back pay, interest, penalties. A figure that would change everything. I need to sign? Here, and initial here. He signed. His hand was steady. The pen scratched against the paper. The woman smiled. The funds will be deposited within 10 business days. You'll receive a letter confirming the deposit. Do you have a bank account? No. We can issue a check. A check is fine. It will be mailed to the address you provide. Do you have an address? Carl looked at Roy. Roy looked at the floor. I'm between addresses, Carl said. You can use mine, Roy said. I'll forward it to you. The woman looked at them both. She had seen worse. She had seen men who had been cheated out of their pensions for decades, men who had died before the paperwork was approved, men who had spent their last years in trailers and shelters and the back seats of cars. I'll make sure it's expedited, she said. The money came through on a Friday. Roy drove back to the boxcar with the check in his hand. 8 years of back pay, 40 years of service. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Enough for a room. Enough for a winter. Enough to stop being a ghost, but Carl was not in the boxcar. The door was open. The stove was cold. The quilt was folded on the plywood bed. The milk crate was empty. The lantern was on the floor, its glass cracked. Roy stood in the doorway and called Carl's name. The wind answered. The Cottonwoods answered. The empty gravel road answered. He walked inside. The boxcar smelled of cold metal and ash and the faint sweetness of the last candle. He found the note on the windowsill, tucked behind the glass, written in pencil on a piece of cardboard torn from the side of a package. Roy, thank you for the week. Thank you for the lights. Thank you for the canned goods. Thank your wife for me. I don't need the money. I don't need anything. I had 40 years on the railroad, and that was enough. The pension was never what kept me going. The work was, the men were, the trains were. I took the original agreement. The one you showed me. I want to keep it. Don't look for me. I'll be fine. Roy read the note 3 times. He folded it and put it in his pocket. He looked at the boxcar, the home that Carl had built from nothing, the home that was about to be hauled away and scrapped, and he thought about the difference between a job and a life. He drove home. That night, a man named Dale Winslow sat in his office in a corporate park outside Chicago and stared at his computer screen. He had received an email from the pension office in Bismarck, copied to him because his name was still on the distribution list for the Northern Pacific Division, even though the division no longer existed and neither did the railroad, not really. The email said that Carl Mathers, a retired employee, had been reinstated for back pension payments totaling approximately $112,000, including interest and penalties. Dale Winslow had been the one who authorized the system update in 2012. He had been the one who signed off on the new database. He had been the one who told his team to flag any inactive records for review, knowing full well that some would fall through the cracks, knowing full well that some would be lost, knowing full well that the company would save money on every record that was never found. He had done it because his bonus depended on cost cutting. He had done it because his boss had told him to. He had done it because he was good at his job, and being good at his job meant making the numbers work, and the numbers worked better when old men disappeared. He had been promoted twice since then. He had a corner office. He had a wife and 2 kids and a house in the suburbs. He had a retirement account that was fully funded. He had never thought about Carl Mathers, not once. Not until the email. Dale Winslow closed the email. He opened his calendar. He had a meeting in 10 minutes. He stood up, straightened his tie, and walked to the conference room, and he did not think about Carl Mathers again. But something had changed. Something in the air. Something in the way the fluorescent lights hummed. Something in the way the carpet smelled of dust and cleaning fluid. He sat down at the conference table. He smiled at his colleagues. He opened his laptop, and then his phone rang. It was his wife. "Sweetheart, I'm in a meeting. Someone's at the house." "What?" "Someone's at the house. They're in the backyard. I saw them from the window. Call the police." "I already did. They're on their way. But I wanted to tell you." "Tell me what?" "They're just standing there. An old man. He's not doing anything. He's just standing in the backyard looking at the house." Dale Winslow felt something cold settle in his chest. "Don't go outside," he said. "I'm not going outside. I'll be home as soon as I can." He hung up. He looked at his colleagues. He looked at the window, the clean glass, the view of the parking lot. "I have to go," he said. Dale Winslow drove home in a hurry. He lived 40 minutes from the office, in a development of identical houses with identical lawns and identical trees that had been planted when the houses were built 15 years ago, all the same size, all the same age, all the same species. His house was at the end of a cul-de-sac. The backyard was fenced. The grass was green. The sprinkler system was on a timer. When he pulled into the driveway, the police were already there. 2 cruisers. An officer in the backyard talking to a man who was sitting on the patio furniture, the wrought iron set that Dale's wife had bought at a garden center, the cushions still in their plastic wrap. Dale got out of the car. He walked around the side of the house. He saw the officer. He saw the man. The man was old, thin, dressed in a jacket with patched elbows. His hands were resting on his knees. He was looking at the yard, the fence, the trees, the bird feeder that Dale's wife had hung from a branch. "Sir," the officer said, "is this your property?" "Yes." "Do you know this man?" Dale looked at the old man. The old man looked at him. There was no anger in his face, no accusation. Just a quiet, patient stillness, the stillness of a man who had spent 40 years watching trains go by. "I don't know him," Dale said. The old man stood up. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a piece of paper. It was folded, creased, worn at the edges. He held it out. Dale did not take it. "What is that?" "My pension agreement," the old man said. "From 1969. I thought you should see it. I don't know what you're talking about. You authorized the system update in 2012. Your name was on the memo. I found it in the public records." Dale felt the cold settle deeper. "That was 8 years ago." "Yes. I don't remember it. I know." The old man unfolded the paper. He looked at it, the faded ink, the uneven type, the signature that he had signed with a fountain pen in an office that smelled of cigarette smoke and coffee grounds. 40 years, he said. "I never missed a shift. I never filed a complaint. I never asked for anything, and you took my pension, not because you needed it, not because I didn't earn it, because you could. I didn't take anything. It was a system error. Yes, a system error, made by a system that you designed, that you approved, that you knew would fail." The officer looked between them. "Sir, I'm going to need you to leave the property." The old man folded the paper. He put it back in his jacket. He looked at Dale, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I'm not here to hurt you," the old man said. "I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to tell you that I know, and that you know that I know. And that's enough." He walked past Dale, past the officer, past the cruiser, down the driveway, down the street, past the identical houses with their identical lawns and their identical trees. Dale watched him go. He stood in his backyard, the sprinkler system clicking on, the water spraying across the grass, the sun setting behind the roof of his house. He went inside. He poured a drink. He sat in his living room in the dark, and he thought about the old man, and about the paper, and about the 40 years that he had tried to erase. He did not sleep that night. The next morning, Dale Winslow went to work. He sat in his corner office. He opened his email. He found the message from the pension office, the one about Carl Mathers, and he deleted it. Then he opened his calendar. He had a meeting in 10 minutes. He stood up. He straightened his tie. He walked to the conference room. But on the way, he stopped. He looked out the window. He saw the parking lot, the cars, the people walking to their offices, the sky gray and low and cold. He thought about the old man. He thought about the paper. He thought about the 40 years. He went back to his office. He closed the door. He sat down. He picked up the phone. He called the pension office in Bismarck. "Send me the file," he said. "Carl Mathers. I want to see the original documents." "Sir, the case is closed." The back pay has been issued. Send me the file anyway. He waited. The file arrived. He opened it. He read the original agreement, the one from 1969, the one that had been signed by a man who had never missed a shift, never filed a complaint, never asked for anything. He read it 3 times. Then he called his lawyer. I need to make some changes, he said. A month later, Carl Mathers sat on a bench in a small park in Minot, North Dakota. The snow had come. The ground was white. The trees were bare. The wind was cold. He had a room. A small room in a boarding house, with a bed and a stove and a window that looked out at the street. He had bought new clothes. He had bought a coat. He had bought a pair of boots that fit. He had not cashed the check. He carried it in his pocket, folded and creased, next to the original pension agreement from 1969. He did not need it. He had never needed it. What he had needed was something else, something that could not be deposited or withdrawn or transferred. He had needed to be seen, and now he had been seen. By Roy. By the pension office. By the man in the corner office who had authorized the system update and who had, in the end, looked at the file and seen what he had done. Dale Winslow had not apologized. He had not written a letter. He had not called. But he had done something else. He had resigned. The news had reached Carl through Roy, who had heard it from the union, who had heard it from the regional manager. Dale Winslow had left his job, his corner office, his bonus, his retirement account. He had cited personal reasons. He had not given an interview. He had not made a statement. But everyone knew. Act 7. Carl stayed in Minot through the winter. He rented the room month to month. He ate at the diner on Main Street, the same diner he had eaten at 40 years ago, when he was a young man with grease under his nails and a future that stretched out like the tracks. The same booths, the same counter, the same pie case, the same coffee that was always too hot and too strong. He did not tell anyone his story. He did not need to. The people in the diner knew him as the old man who came in for breakfast and read the newspaper and drank his coffee black. They did not ask questions. They did not pry. It was February when the letter came. It was in a plain envelope, no return address, postmarked from Chicago. Carl opened it at the boarding house table, the afternoon light falling across the worn wood, the snow falling outside the window. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten. The handwriting was careful, the letters small and even, the kind of handwriting that came from practice and effort. Mr. Mathers, I am not writing to ask for forgiveness. I am not writing to explain myself. I am writing because I owe you something that I cannot give in person. I have spent the last 4 months trying to understand what I did, not the system error, not the database, the decision, the choice I made to look the other way. The choice I made to let the system work as it was designed to work, knowing that it would hurt people like you. I cannot undo it. I cannot give you back the 8 years. I cannot give back the nights you spent in the cold, the weeks you spent in a boxcar, the months you spent wondering if anyone would ever find you. But I can tell you that I see you now. I see the 40 years. I see the work. I see the man who never missed a shift, never filed a complaint, never asked for anything. I am sorry. Dale Winslow. Carl read the letter twice. He folded it carefully, along the creases, and placed it next to the pension agreement in his jacket pocket. He sat at the table for a long time, watching the snow fall, listening to the wind, feeling the warmth of the radiator that clicked and hissed in the corner of the room. He did not write back. Spring came. The snow melted. The ground softened. The cottonwoods budded. Carl left Minot. He took a bus to a town he had passed through once, 40 years ago, a town so small it wasn't on most maps. He had remembered it because of the water tower painted with the name of the high school, and because of the grain elevator that stood at the edge of the tracks, and because of the woman who had served him coffee at a diner that was no longer there. He got off the bus. He walked to the edge of town. He found a small house, white and peeling, with a porch that sagged and a yard that was overgrown. The house was for rent. The price was low. He rented it. He bought a bed, a table, a chair, a stove. He bought a kettle and a pot and a cup. He bought a lamp. He did not buy a phone. He did not buy a television. He did not buy a computer. He had the pension agreement. He had the letter. He had the check, still uncashed, still folded in his pocket. He did not need anything else. On the first warm day of May, Carl sat on the porch of the small house. The sun was setting. The sky was orange and pink and purple. The air smelled of grass and dirt and the faint sweetness of something blooming. He heard a train in the distance. The whistle. The rumble. The sound of metal on metal. The sound that had been the soundtrack of his life for 40 years. He stood up. He walked to the edge of the yard. He could see the tracks a quarter-mile away, running parallel to the road. The train was coming. A freight train. Long and slow and heavy. He watched it pass. The locomotives, the cars, the containers, the names of the railroads, some of them familiar, some of them new. The sound of the wheels, the rhythm, the beat that had never left his bones. He stood there until the train was gone, until the tracks were empty, until the sound faded into the distance and the evening was quiet again. He went back to the porch. He sat down. He looked at the sky, the stars coming out one by one, the moon rising over the grain elevator. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the pension agreement. He unfolded it. He read the first line, the same line he had read 1,000 times. This agreement is entered into between the Northern Pacific Railroad and Carl Mathers, hereinafter referred to as the employee. He folded it. He put it back. He thought about Roy. He thought about the boxcar. He thought about the woman in the quilt, the man in the doorway, the dust from the gravel road rising and settling and rising again. He thought about Dale Winslow sitting in his corner office, looking at the file, seeing what he had done. He thought about the letter, the words, the apology. He did not know if he had forgiven him. He did not know if forgiveness was something that could be given or taken or held in your hand like a piece of paper. But he knew that he was here, in this house, on this porch, watching the stars, and that was enough. The next morning, Carl walked into town. He went to the post office. He bought an envelope. He addressed it to Dale Winslow, care of the pension office in Bismarck, which would forward it to the address on file. He did not write a letter. He did not write a note. He did not write a single word. He put the check inside, the check for $112,000, the back pay, the interest, the penalties. He sealed the envelope. He handed it to the clerk. Will this reach him? Should take about 3 days. Carl nodded. He turned. He walked out of the post office, into the morning light, into the spring air, into the town that had no name for him and no memory of him and no expectation of him. He walked back to the small house. He sat on the porch. He watched the clouds move across the sky. He listened to the birds. He felt the sun on his face. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out the pension agreement. He unfolded it. He read the first line. Then he folded it. He put it back. He had kept it, the original, the one Roy had shown him. The one that proved he had existed, that he had worked, that he had been part of something larger than himself. He did not need the money. He had never needed the money. What he had needed was the paper. He sat on the porch until the sun set, and then he went inside. He lit the lamp. He made a cup of tea. He sat at the table, the pension agreement in front of him, the letter from Dale Winslow beside it. He did not read them again. He did not need to. He simply sat. And the night was quiet, and the house was warm. And the window, the small window in the wall of the kitchen, let in the light of the moon.